Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar today. We'll be getting started in just a minute or two. Hi, everyone. This is Victoria Hendrickson from Org Vitality. Thanks for joining our webinar on nudging within surveys. We'll be getting started in just a moment here. All right, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar today. My name is Victoria Hendrickson, and I will be leading you through this webinar on nudging. More specifically, today's webinar is called Optimizing Your Survey, Nudging for Better Feedback. This is part one of a two-part series of nudging within surveys. So today we'll be talking about the survey design and administration process. And then at this time next week, we'll be talking about nudges in the action planning phase of surveys. So if you're interested in action planning, go ahead and put that on your calendar for next week and make sure you join us for that. But again, today we'll start a little earlier in the survey process to talk about how we use nudges to get better data in order to have good findings to nudge on later in the process. So couple housekeeping things before we get started here. The first thing to say is we are recording today's session, and I will be sending along the link to the recording as long as the slides I'm sharing today at the end of the webinar. So no need to take detailed notes. You'll be getting all of this afterwards. Speaking of afterwards, you'll also be getting a survey at the end. Org Vitality is a survey company, so of course we're going to send you a survey to get a sense of your experience of this webinar, and that feedback really helps us develop future webinars and really target these to be on the topics and formatted in ways that are most helpful for you. So if you could take a couple minutes to complete that at the end, it would be really helpful for us. So with all that said, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We have a quick session today of 30 minutes, so I'm going to dive on in. First thing we've got here is quick intro. Again, my name is Victoria Hendrickson. I am a partner and vice president on the consulting side here at Org Vitality, PhD in background in IO psychology, and I work primarily on the employee research and survey side here. So I do research on a number of things, including nudges, survey comments, inclusion and diversity. But one thing I really want to say is, specific to research on nudges, I've been working on this and presenting on it since, I believe, 2014. I did look it up. And I was comparing some different presentations I've done on nudges within surveys and how they've ranged throughout just a couple of years here. And when I first started doing these, a lot of the questions I got were, what is nudging and what does it even have to do with surveys? And now we're getting to a much more nuanced kind of conversation, and there's a lot of interest and knowledge out there. Just want to point to the fact that this is one of our more popular webinars already this year. That people are showing up because they know what nudging is and they want to hear more about it. But that's really come a long way from just a few years ago as to what a nudge is. But although it's much more popular now, we do hear a lot of different definitions out in the marketplace as far as what people are looking for within nudges. So I do want to start with some grounding on what I mean by nudging and how the overall concept applies to the survey space. So starting at the very beginning, the concept of nudging comes from the field of behavioral economics, and in particular, a book by the name of Nudge from Thaler and Sunstein. So they define a nudge as setting up a choice architecture to alter behavior in a predictable way without removing or changing incentives. So that makes sense, but what does it mean to the survey space? If I'm to put this in kind of an IO or organizational effectiveness context, I think about nudges as setting up systems in a way that promotes positive behavior change. So when we're designing nudges, we're thinking about how can we help people live up to their own good intentions, whether that's helping, provide more useful feedback or sticking with an improvement plan. Different ways that can show up as we're thinking about how we want employees to fill out a survey. And I'm sure a lot of you have examples of nudges. So whether they're out in the world or things you think about in regards to your survey program specifically, there are a lot of companies and products that claim to be nudges. And some of those are science-based systems that help make positive behavior change, and some are just notifications. So these promises and claims are true of general technology you'll find out there, as well as survey tools. So what I want to do is take a moment to do a bit of a nudge or not, and kind of look at a couple of examples here and decide whether they really fit the definition of a nudge or if they're really just a notification masquerading as a science-based nudge. So what do we have on screen here? Over on the far left, that screenshot is a reminder to take a survey or act on it, saying survey actions, time to do it now. To pop up, it's going to remind me. Same thing over on the right here, this Outlook notification. It's going to stop me with whatever I'm doing at that time and remind me it's survey time. Certainly useful, but is it a nudge? We'll get to that. Kind of in the middle of the page, this is an alarm clock with a $100 bill in it. And the way this works is that if I push snooze, it will snooze, but it will also shred that $100 bill. So, would that be more likely to get me out of bed? Probably. But is it actually a nudge? TBD. Then over on the far right side, we have a kind of system notification, and it's a little blurry, so I'll read it. At the top, it says, "Are you sure you want to do that? Clicking yes will make Comic Sans your new system default font. Seriously, have you thought this through?" The green button says yes, do it now, and the red button says no, I'm insane. So we've got someone who programmed that's got some opinions on whether Comic Sans should be your system default font. So range of examples here. These are all things that in different ways have claimed to be nudges by either relating to some kind of commitment, some kind of framing around what a good choice is, or notifications. So at this point, I want to step back and talk about how do we evaluate nudges and evaluate whether any one of these things is going to reduce the cognitive load to help us make a good choice, help us make positive behavioral change here. So let's start by talking about how nudges work. They work by using heuristics or mental shortcuts, ways to help reduce cognitive load and make good choices easier. So we're not taking away any choices. We're not incentivizing a particular choice, but we want to make it easier to spot and make the right choice or the one that's good for me as a user in some way. One way to do that is to invoke social pressure. So when we talk about social pressure kind of nudges, we want to give this feeling of everyone else is making this choice. So isn't this something that might be good for you as well? Cycle is not by altruistic. So this involves making the positive choice more obvious and available. So again, that's really reducing the cognitive load, making it just really clear what that default should be. So this is done with food a lot as an example. That book called Nudge is an experiment in school cafeterias geared towards getting kids to eat more vegetables. We're not taking away any of the candy. We're not making the vegetables cheaper. But what the researchers did was they put the carrot sticks and other healthy options at what is a kid's eye level and the junk food kind of choices higher or lower. And by doing that, they found that the carrots and other healthy options were chosen much more frequently than in some control groups. So just by making it easier to choose. And then finally, the third option here is changing the default. And when we look at research on nudging, changing the default is by far is much, much more effective than the other two. So this is often where we really focus in the survey space. But a familiar example in general is 401k programs. So we want to give people the choice to opt in or opt out to 401k programs and choose the program that's right for them. But we do have to start with a default. And so these days, a lot of programs sign people up for the 401k by default. So they can choose to opt out if they don't want it, but they're choosing to opt out rather than opt in. So the choice is still there, but the system is making it easier for them to make that positive choice of being active in the program rather than the other way around. So a lot of this is about helping people live up to their own good intentions. And, at its core, a nudge should really be simple. The goal is to reduce cognitive load, make it easier for people to make behavior change and help them live up to those good intentions. So with these criteria of what a nudge is and how it works, I want to return to some of these examples and we'll decide, what's really a nudge here and what's masquerading. So starting, with the more basic examples, those reminders, I'm going to say, off the bat, these two are not nudges. These pop-ups might be helpful and they might be good at, reminding us of something to do, but the act of getting a pop-up notification does not reduce cognitive load. We will get into how to craft reminders that are nudges, but I want to make the point and the distinction that it's the information in a reminder or a pop-up notification that can invoke the concepts of nudging, not the notification itself. Next example we've got here is that alarm clock. So this is really a commitment device to help make positive change. So, this is something that, as an individual, decided set my alarm clock and put whatever bill in there I think is going to, be an appropriate incentive to get out of bed. I've given this one kind of a yellow check mark because it is a nudge. It is helping me make positive behavioral changes. The yellow aspect of this check mark is because technically there is a bit of an incentive there. It's a self-imposed incentive. So it's still within a nudge, but it's kind of borderline there. But really, the one that's clearly a nudge to me here is this pop-up asking if I really do want to make Comic Sans my new system default font. This is involving some social pressure. It's saying, are you insane? Do you really want to make Comic Sans your new system default font? Hopefully no one on the phone is a huge fan of Comic Sans. But it's really bringing in that social desirability heuristic. So these are some basics, just some nudges out in the world, but let's move on here to talk about nudges and surveys and specifically how we use them to get better data. So, let's step back. Why would we want to use nudges and surveys? Some things we know are true. Managers really want to improve the workplace. Survey goals are to improve the workplace, and the survey assignments are complex database exercises. So this is a good opportunity to use a nudge to reduce that complexity and help stakeholders across the organization live up to their own good intentions about how to drive improvement. There's a number of ways about how we can nudge throughout the survey process. And so again, today we're really going to be focusing on that data collection aspect. We can nudge individual employees to respond to the survey and to provide useful feedback in a way that'll be meaningful. In the next webinar, we'll focus on actions and specifically how to help managers identify what to work on and stick with that plan. But for now, we're going to start with getting the data we need. And in particular, with this first challenge, we want to start by getting enough data. In our roles as survey practitioners, we need as many employees to respond as possible for overall representation and for driving reports down to the local level. So we've found a lot of success by using social pressure nudges. If employees feel that everyone else is responding to the survey and making their voice heard, well, that employee doesn't want to be left out. So we apply this nudge through the timing and content of our reminders. So throughout, different survey programs, depending on the window of your administration, after you send a welcome letter, often you'll send reminders to those who either haven't submitted or haven't started their surveys yet. And those can be a couple times a week. They can be, based on other communication schedules. But we found one of the most effective ways to do this is to send a reminder as soon as the response rate hits 51%. And the reason we do that is because then we send a reminder that says, hey, most people have filled out the survey. Don't miss this opportunity to have your voice heard. So, again, that's invoking the social pressure that everyone else is making their voice heard. This is your opportunity, etc. So, you can send this reminder at different times, but we like to send it right at that 51% mark because technically most people have responded. That is a majority, but it still gives people enough time to respond on their own schedules. So, that's the first approach to just getting more people to respond. The next piece is thinking about the feedback itself. So once we've worked through getting a sufficient amount of data, we want to make sure that we're getting honest and actionable data. Often we find that in upward feedback kinds of instruments, there are rating patterns where employees will mark items artificially high or low across the board rather than differentiating across different kinds of behavioral statements. So they're rating based on an overall opinion, and that tends to be less useful in driving behavioral change of the person receiving the feedback. So here we've found that a framing nudge is really useful. We tell raters where their ratings are falling on an overall pattern, and we tell them if they're an extreme respondent. And that way they can consider, whether the person they're rating is actually a case of extreme high or low behaviors, or whether they should edit a couple of these. So, the way we do this nudge is we show responders where their response patterns fall, if they're over on an extreme side of the bell curve, and, what percentage that falls. So, are they within a 1% kind of thing, and do they want to confirm that that person really is that high or low? They can still submit the ratings as they are, but they do have to confirm that that is the pattern that reflects the reality of the person they're rating here. And so we found that by doing this, one, it doesn't impact submission rates, so people don't get distracted or frustrated by confirming this. And it does tend to drive highly positive raters closer to the mean. So often some of those behavioral statements are still rated high, but there's more variation in the overall rating pattern. So rather than all 5s or all 1s, we see use of more of the scale and more of the middle of the scale. And so then the next option I want to show you here is, again, based on getting quality kinds of feedback. And so, this kind of data collection challenge is primarily targeted towards open-ended feedback. So those of you on the phone who've been doing surveys a long time have likely had the challenge of being buried under a mountain of vague comments, looking for the needle in the haystack. So looking for that useful or specific piece of feedback that's actually likely to drive action. And so here, the kind of nudge we use tends to be framing. So we want to clarify with employees what kinds of feedback is actionable and useful. We find in all of our research that employees want to provide actionable feedback. They're taking the time to answer your survey or answer, whatever assessment because they care and they want to see positive change, but they're not database experts. So often they need a little bit of framing on, how they can provide their ideas in a way that's useful. And so the way we do this is we provide a nudge in the directions for the comment section. So we provide a statement that clarifies what kind of comments are useful and actionable. We actually did an experimental field study where we had one group that got the nudge instructions and one group that did not. They just got regular instructions clarifying confidentiality, and we found that having the nudge led to 5 times more useful comments. So, what we get from this is users can still certainly provide vague comments, things like pay me more, etc., but they're much more likely to give us descriptive kind of statements and actionable solutions when we provide that nudge. We also found in this study that we got more comments. So not only did we get, more useful feedback, but more people actually responded to the comment item. And, the working theory on that is, by telling people what kind of feedback is likely to be useful, we're also sending a message that we're going to read this, and we really are looking for statements that are going to drive change and drive things forward. So that gave people a sense that someone really is reading this. It really is important. And so a bit of a win-win there, in that they got a little feedback there, and we got more useful data that we could work with and drive throughout the organization. So those are 3 examples of nudges we use at OB to collect more data and more useful data throughout surveys. The nudges I described might work for your organizations, though all would benefit from specific definitions and customizations for any survey. No one nudge is the same across any of our clients. Each are really adapted to both the content of a survey as well as the users likely to respond to the survey. So, with that in mind, and thinking about how different each of the organizations represented on the phone are today, I want to end with a couple of tips for designing nudges in your own survey program. And the first is really to define what is useful or actionable. If you're nudging for useful or actionable kinds of data, the first thing to do is to really step back and say, what is actionable for you? Is it going to be more variance in ratings? Are you finding that all of your items are just so high that it's hard to drive action? Are you looking for more detailed comments, or are you looking for something else? The point here is to really start with the end in mind, so that you can design nudges that are going to frame up that kind of target appropriately. The next piece is then to use that target when you design the items themselves. Often people come to us asking about nudging for, what the user interface will look like, or in the action planning. But, think about it in terms of the items themselves and what you're trying to capture. And then aside from the content, there is some design and user experience that can make it easier for people to give you more useful feedback. So one example I like here is with the open-ended comments. So when you're thinking about your open-ended comments, if you want people to give you a description of an issue and a solution to make it better, well, give them a box for the description and give them a box for the solution. That tends to not cost anything to do differently, and it gets people in the pattern of giving you those 2 pieces of data, and it also gives you a lot of great analysis possibilities as well. So then, aside from the actual user experience, there's a piece around transparency here. You want to be transparent about the kind of feedback you're looking for and want employees to provide. Employees want to give you good feedback. When they give you all 5s on a 360, or, if they pay me more in their comments, they're trying to give you useful feedback, and they assume that's helpful. So, if they're not data experts and you are looking for more variance, or you are looking for something specific in your data, you're going to need to give them some context. So, use that to think through the different framing pieces in the survey, whether it's directions, FAQs, et cetera. Those kinds of things tend to be helpful for employees. And then finally, the last piece here is to make it easy for employees to respond. And this sounds really obvious, but I want to make the point that all of the best designs on the above points are, all for naught if employees don't respond to the survey. So consider your overall user experience, whether it's things like being mobile adaptive, or considering your response window, just to make it easy for employees to respond and get you that piece of data. So, with this, I want to return to our overall model here of strategy and site action, and the different pieces of the survey process. Today we spoke about the insight bubble and how we can collect data that's more useful. Next week at this time, we'll be focusing on that action component. So we'll be talking all about how to use nudges to drive meaningful action in terms of how we help managers choose what they want to work on, how to keep it top of mind as business needs shift, and ultimately live up to their own good intentions. And speaking of next week's webinar, we want to encourage as many of you to come back to that one as possible. And we want to have some continuity between these 2 webinars. So it started today by going through a bit of a nudge or not with some examples of nudges. And for next week, I'd love to see some of your nudges, whether they're nudges you use in your own survey programs, or whether it's just something you see out in the world. So short answer, send me your best nudge or not. I'm going to be emailing all of you with a set of slides and recording from today. And in that email, I'll be inviting you to send me your best nudge or not. And, the best example, we'll be sending a copy of this book, Misbehaving, by Richard Thaler. He was one of the authors of the original nudge book, wonderful author and behavioral economist. So I've just started reading Misbehaving. I think it's great, and we would love to provide a copy to one of you. So again, hoping to see some really good nudge or not examples from all of you today. But for now, we've just got a couple minutes left here, so I'd like to go ahead and move into questions. So as you all think about how you'll use nudges in your program, happy to answer any questions about what that looks like. I see a couple already coming through on the chat, so if you've got questions, head on over to the chat box in GoToWebinar, and I will get to as many of these as I can, and any of those that we run out of time for, I'm happy to answer via email. So, all right, we've got a question about item development here. So someone's asking, could you give an example of how nudges can be used in item development? Great question. So, one that comes to mind immediately is going to be a combination of, this survey design and also action planning. So one way we think about the survey is, it's a way to start a conversation of any topic that's really important. So, if we think about survey action, it's something that's important. We want every manager in the company to be moving things forward from the survey. We can ask all managers on the survey if they're likely to commit to action planning. And so there are different ways this question can be framed. It can be a yes, no. It can be a, do you have what you need to lead to action planning? If so, what do you need, et cetera. But often just adding that question of whether the manager is committed to driving action from the survey they are taking tends to really improve action planning, across those groups. So part of that is social pressure. They know that the correct answer is to say, yes, I am going to drive forward meaningful action planning. And then there's a bit of a commitment device. On that survey, they said they were going to lead to action planning. So that's something they're already in for. Another example I like is in the inclusion and diversity space. Often we ask questions at the company level, the team level, and the individual level. And inclusion and diversity items tend to score very positively since they are quite values-based. So, there's one question that I like to use that scores really high, but it's more for the aspect of nudging people into action. And that question is, I know what I can do to drive a more inclusive workplace. And so when someone says yes to that, they are, one, invoking kind of that social desirability. Yes, I know I want to make it an inclusive workspace. I know that's something that's important to do. But also, again, it's a bit of a commitment device of, all right, I said I know what to do to make this an inclusive workplace. So that's something I have to continue to do. And those heuristics are invoked at the time someone takes the survey. And they're also invoked at the time of, discussing survey results. So when those come back and you start to talk through the results of each question, people are reminded of those intentions and the way they responded. So, whether it's survey action or inclusion, diversity, or something else, I think it's that idea of reminding the employee that they know, understand, and commit to doing whatever it is that's important. And I think with those items, the more behavioral they are, the better. All right, so it's here. So we are going to move on from questions, but again, I'm happy to answer any others via email. So from here, our last slide is a little bit about us at Org Vitality and the kinds of services. We work primarily around employee surveys, 360s, and other kinds of projects that bring together customized technology along with robust employee research. So I hope you'll all join us this time next week to talk about nudges in survey action planning. But for today, this will conclude our webinar, and I will follow up with you each individually via email. Thanks so much for joining the webinar.